Carla was only 17. She was sweet, full of life. I never thought something like this could happen to her.
I remember the news that night. A date after a high school Valentine's dance, and then she was gone. Who could do something like that?
Fort Worth, Texas. Valentine's weekend, 1974. The city was alive with teenage laughter, young love, and the promise of spring. But for one family, February 16th would be the day their world collapsed forever. 17-year-old Carla Walker, bright, beautiful, and deeply loved, was kidnapped, assaulted, and murdered after what should have been a joyful night out. For decades, her story was trapped in silence, her killer unknown. Her family left with nothing but grief. It would take 46 years, a revolution in forensic science, and a determined cold case team to finally unmask the man who took Carla's life, Glenn Samuel M.C. Curley. This is the story of a murder frozen in time and the relentless pursuit of justice that refused to die. Carla Jan Walker was just 17 years old, the kind of girl whose presence could brighten an entire room. Born in 1956, she grew up in Fort Worth, Texas, with a warmth that reflected the city's southern charm. Friends remembered her as kind, funny, and devoted to her family. She loved cheerleading, adored music, and had the kind of easy smile that made people trust her. To her boyfriend, Rodney M.C. Coy, Carla was everything. Rodney was the quarterback of the Western Hills High School football team, tall, confident, and deeply in love with her. They had been dating for months, and by all accounts, theirs was the kind of relationship that seemed destined to last. Carla and Rodney were the classic picture of young love in the 1970s. Late-night phone calls, weekend dates, and endless plans for the future. On the evening of February 16, 1974, excitement filled the air. It was Valentine's weekend, and the Western Hills High School Valentine's Dance was the event of the season. Girls wore their best dresses, boys their pressed jackets. Carla wore a lovely blue dress with lace details, and Rodney couldn't take his eyes off her. The dance was filled with laughter, photographs, and the heady energy of teenagers living out one of the happiest nights of their young lives. Afterward, Carla and Rodney, like so many couples, wanted the night to last just a little bit longer. They left the dance and drove to a bowling alley, a common hangout spot for teens at the time. They played games, chatted with friends, and enjoyed each other's company until it was late. Around midnight, the two left in Rodney's car and parked outside Carla's home, just a few steps away from the safety of her front door. What happened next would scar the city forever. As Rodney parked outside the Walker home, he leaned over to kiss Carla goodnight, but before the moment could linger, a man appeared out of the shadows. He yanked open the car door and pointed a gun directly at Rodney's head. The man barked orders, his voice cold and threatening. Rodney froze, unable to move. Carla, terrified, clutched at him, whispering, "It's okay, it's okay," trying to calm him, trying to calm herself. But the man wasn't there to talk. He struck Rodney over the head with the butt of his pistol, hard enough to daze him, leaving blood trickling down his face. Rodney would later recall the sound, sharp, violent, final. As Rodney reeled from the blow, the attacker turned his rage toward Carla. He dragged her out of the car. She screamed, her voice piercing the quiet Fort Worth neighborhood. Rodney, stunned but conscious, tried to fight back, but the gun was still there, heavy, unrelenting, promising death with the slightest twitch of a finger. The attacker shoved Carla toward another car parked nearby, his own. Rodney heard Carla's cries fade into the night as the car sped away. And then silence. A silence that would last 46 years. In shock, Rodney stumbled to Carla's house. He pounded on the door, shouting for help. Her parents woke in terror, their world unraveling as Rodney told them what had happened. "She's gone," he gasped, blood running down his face. "A man? He took her." The Walker family called police immediately. Officers swarmed the neighborhood, searching the streets, questioning neighbors, and checking for any sign of Carla or the car she had been forced into. But the attacker had vanished into the dark. Rodney's account was detailed, but in the confusion of the night, police feared it was the rambling of a traumatized teenager. He remembered the man's size, the coldness in his eyes, the strength in his hands, but it wasn't enough. The attacker had worn dark clothing and gloves, leaving little behind. For Rodney, the minutes after Carla was taken stretched into an eternity. He replayed the attack again and again in his mind, tortured by the thought that he couldn't protect her. He was 17. He was just a boy. And yet, he would spend the rest of his life haunted by that one night, that one moment he wished he could change. Police launched an extensive search the next morning. They combed the roads, nearby fields, and wooded areas. Volunteers joined in, hoping that Carla had escaped, that she might be hiding, injured but alive. But as the hours passed, hope began to dwindle. By February 19th, 3 days after she was kidnapped, Carla Walker's body was discovered in a culvert near Benbrook Lake, not far from her home. The details were horrifying. Carla had been bound, assaulted, and ultimately strangled. The brutality of the crime shocked even seasoned investigators. 17 years old, with her entire future ahead of her, Carla's life had been extinguished in the most violent way imaginable. The news spread quickly across Fort Worth. Schools held vigils, and churches filled with mourners. Parents clutched their children tighter, suddenly aware that danger could strike even in the quiet suburbs they thought were safe. For Carla's family, the discovery was devastating. Her parents were inconsolable, her siblings shattered. Rodney, racked with guilt and grief, could barely process the loss. One moment they were laughing in a car after a Valentine's dance. The next, Carla was gone. Carla Walker's murder wasn't just another crime. It became a wound in Fort Worth's collective memory. The brutality of the attack, the swiftness of her abduction, and the helplessness of those who loved her turned her into a symbol of innocence stolen, of justice denied, and of a case that demanded answers. At Carla's funeral, hundreds gathered to say goodbye. White flowers covered her casket. Her cheerleading squad, her friends, and her classmates wept openly. The sight of Rodney, barely able to stand, leaving the graveside with his head bowed, was one that etched itself into the memory of everyone who attended. Fort Worth, 1974, a city that was supposed to protect its children, a night that was supposed to celebrate love, a life that should have gone on to fulfill all its promises. But for Carla Walker, Valentine's weekend became her last night on Earth, and for police it became the beginning of one of the most haunting unsolved cases in Texas history. The crime scene outside the bowling alley parking lot in Fort Worth was both clear and confusing. Investigators quickly realized this wasn't a simple case of a runaway or a teenage dispute. The violence described by Carla's boyfriend, Rodney M.C. Coy, painted the picture of an ambush. Police swarmed the area that Valentine's weekend in 1974, dusting for prints, combing for fibers, and questioning potential witnesses. Rodney, bruised and battered from the pistol whipping he endured, was their most immediate source of information. Through swollen eyes, he told detectives about the stranger who appeared from the shadows of the parking lot, the gun pressed to his head, the demand that seemed targeted not at robbery but at Carla herself. Rodney recalled hearing Carla's voice, calm but trembling, pleading with the attacker not to kill him. Then she was gone. When Carla's body was discovered 3 days later, dumped in a drainage ditch near Benbrook Lake, the horror deepened. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. For a 17-year-old girl full of life, joy, and plans, the ending was brutal and final. The Fort Worth Police Department poured resources into the case. Valentine's Day was supposed to be filled with roses and chocolates, not funeral arrangements. The brutality of Carla's murder shocked the city. Newspapers carried her photo daily, urging the public to help track down the suspect. Detectives initially believed the killer might have been someone in Carla's orbit, perhaps a jealous classmate, an obsessive admirer, or even someone who followed her from the bowling alley. The crime was intimate, too violent to be purely random, they thought, but every lead seemed to go nowhere. Rodney's description of the suspect was frustratingly vague. White male, stocky build, middle-aged, but in 1974, Fort Worth was filled with men who fit that description. Sketches were drawn, composites circulated, yet no one came forward with a solid identification. Detectives looked at the boyfriend himself. As with so many murder cases, suspicion initially fell on the closest person to the victim. Rodney's account of the events, being knocked unconscious, then waking to find Carla gone, was dramatic. Some investigators quietly wondered if the story was too dramatic. Was it possible Rodney had fabricated the tale to cover up his own involvement? But the evidence didn't align. His injuries were real, his grief was raw, and crucially, his timeline placed him exactly where he said he was, a victim alongside Carla, not the mastermind behind her disappearance. Eventually, the suspicion around Rodney faded, though whispers lingered in the community for years. In 1974, forensic science was far less advanced. There were no DNA databases, no sophisticated testing methods that could trace a microscopic sample back to a suspect. What investigators did have were Carla's clothing and physical evidence collected from her body. Seminal fluid had been recovered, critical biological evidence. But at the time, it was useful only to establish blood type. The sample indicated a common profile that matched thousands of men in Texas alone. Without DNA technology, it was like holding the killer's fingerprint but being unable to read it. That evidence was sealed, stored, and preserved, a silent witness waiting for science to catch up. Carla's murder rattled Fort Worth. parents clutched their daughters tighter, warning them not to stay out late, not to trust strangers, not to walk alone. In the mid-1970s, North Texas was already uneasy with rising crime rates. But this case hit especially hard. Carla wasn't a stranger in a bad neighborhood. She was a popular cheerleader, the kind of girl who smiled in every yearbook photo, who attended church, who was well-loved. If someone like her could be targeted, then no one was truly safe. For weeks, detectives canvassed neighborhoods, questioned known sex offenders, and chased rumors. One suspect after another was paraded into the interrogation room, but the evidence never stuck. Then silence. Months stretched into years. Carla's classmates graduated, leaving her memory immortalized in high school photographs and tearful recollections. Her family clung to hope, but the investigation stalled. By the 1980s, the case was officially cold. Detectives retired, passing the unsolved file to fresh faces who inherited more questions than answers. The police department never gave up completely, but Carla's name was one among dozens of cold cases stacking up in filing cabinets. Still, for her family, time did nothing to dull the ache. Her siblings spoke often of how the murder had split their lives in two, before Carla's death and after. Her parents carried grief like a permanent scar, longing for answers that never came. Over the decades, whispers circled through Fort Worth. Some thought the killer must have been someone local, a man who lived quietly among them. Others believed he had drifted away, leaving Texas behind to commit other crimes elsewhere. Several men became persons of interest. A few confessed falsely, seeking attention. Others fit the vague physical description, but could not be tied by evidence. Each time the family's hopes rose, they were dashed again when the lead fizzled out. Rodney, Carla's boyfriend, carried his own burden. For decades, some in the community unfairly pointed fingers his way. Though investigators had long since cleared him, the cloud of suspicion never fully disappeared. For Rodney, every new interview, every anniversary of Carla's death, reopened old wounds. He was not only the boy who had lost the girl he loved, but also the boy who had to prove his innocence in the court of public opinion. By the 1990s and early 2000s, Carla's case felt like a ghost story in Fort Worth. It was remembered but faintly, like a haunting presence at the edge of the community's memory. Her family continued to push, asking for updates, begging the police not to forget. Detectives retested evidence when new DNA techniques emerged, but the results didn't match anyone in the national databases. The biological sample was still there, preserved carefully, but without a match, it was as if the killer's name was written in an alphabet no one could yet translate. 40 years passed. Carla's parents died without answers. The case seemed frozen in time, unsolvable, destined to remain a tragic mystery of the 1970s. And yet, in the background, technology was evolving. A revolution in forensic science, one that would change cold cases across America, was quietly building momentum. Carla's file wasn't closed. It was simply waiting. Waiting for the science to speak, waiting for justice to finally knock on the door of a man who had kept his secret buried for nearly half a century. For nearly half a century, the file labeled Carla Walker had gathered dust in the cold case unit of the Fort Worth Police Department. Detectives had picked it up and set it down countless times. The pain of the case was sharp, but the lack of progress was sharper still. And yet, a single piece of evidence had endured the decades, the biological sample taken from Carla's body in 1974. It had been preserved, sealed away in the evidence locker. Through the passage of time, as technology evolved, it remained untouched, waiting for the world to learn how to interpret it. By 2018, the world of forensics was undergoing a revolution. The arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, had proven that long unsolved crimes could be cracked not by traditional fingerprints or eyewitness testimony, but by DNA matched to genealogy databases. Investigators could now take an unknown DNA sample from a crime scene, upload it into consumer DNA platforms like GED Match, and identify relatives of the suspect. From there, genealogists could painstakingly build family trees until they found the one person who fit. Carla's family, watching from the sidelines of this new era, wondered, could this finally be the answer? In 2019, the Fort Worth Police Department partnered with Othram, a forensic genealogy lab in Houston, Texas. Othram specialized in extracting DNA profiles from old degraded samples that traditional labs often struggled with. The sample taken from Carla back in 1974 was sent for analysis. Despite being more than 45 years old, Othram's technology pulled a complete profile. The ghostly traces of the killer's identity were finally transformed into a readable genetic code. When that profile was uploaded to genealogy databases, something remarkable happened. A family line began to emerge. Not a perfect match, but relatives. cousins, second cousins, enough to sketch the outline of a family tree. Genealogists and detectives worked side by side, tracing names, dates, and marriages, slowly narrowing the list of potential suspects. The branches of the tree bent back toward Fort Worth, toward men who would have been living in the city in the 1970s when Carla was murdered. At the center of that narrowing list, one name stood out: Glenn Samuel M.C. Curley. M.C. Curley wasn't a stranger to investigators. In fact, in 1974, his name had surfaced briefly in the original investigation. He owned a Ruger pistol, the same type of weapon that had been used to threaten Rodney M.C. Coy the night Carla was abducted. Police had interviewed him at the time, but without evidence, he had slipped back into obscurity. Now, nearly 50 years later, his DNA said otherwise. Detectives needed to be certain. A genealogical link wasn't enough for an arrest. It had to be confirmed with a direct DNA sample from M.C. Curley himself. In 2020, undercover officers began surveillance on the then 77-year-old man. They quietly followed him, collecting items he discarded. Most importantly, a soda can and a straw. Those items were sent to the lab. When the results came back, the answer was irrefutable. The DNA from McCurley's discarded soda matched the DNA found on Carla Walker's body in 1974. After 46 years, the identity of Carla's killer was no longer a mystery. On September 21, 2020, Fort Worth police knocked on the door of a modest home where M.C. Curley had lived for decades with his wife. To neighbors, he was quiet, unassuming, almost invisible. To detectives, he was the man who had haunted Carla's memory for nearly half a century. M.C. Curley was taken into custody without incident. News of the arrest sent shockwaves through Fort Worth. For Carla's surviving family, it was the call they had prayed for but feared would never come. For Rodney M.C. Coy, it was the vindication he had long needed, the proof that the monster who had ripped Carla from him had finally been unmasked. As reporters swarmed the courthouse in the days following the arrest, a single question hung in the air: how had M.C. Curley managed to live undetected all these years? The answer was chilling in its simplicity. He had blended in. He had aged quietly. He had lived as a husband, a father, a neighbor. All the while, the memory of what he had done remained hidden, until DNA pulled the mask away. For the detectives, there was relief but also a sobering reminder. The arrest didn't erase the decades of pain endured by Carla's family. It didn't bring back the 17-year-old girl stolen on Valentine's night. But it gave something precious: truth. Justice was no longer a hope. It was finally within reach. When news of Glenn Samuel M.C. Curley's arrest broke in September 2020, it wasn't just a headline in Fort Worth. It was a story that resonated across the country. A cold case nearly half a century old had finally cracked, and the people who had waited decades for answers suddenly found themselves on the edge of a courtroom, facing the man accused of stealing Carla Walker's life. In August 2021, M.C. Curley, then 78 years old, was brought before a Texas courtroom to face charges of capital murder. The frail gray-haired man shuffled into court with oxygen tubes visible, a stark contrast to the monstrous crime he was accused of. For many who had carried Carla's memory, seeing him alive and present was surreal. The courtroom was heavy with history. Family members, old friends, and classmates of Carla filled the benches. Some had been teenagers when the crime happened. Now they were parents and grandparents themselves. Decades of grief and longing sat with them as they prepared to hear, at last, the story laid bare in legal proceedings. The state's attorneys opened with a simple but devastating premise. Carla Walker's murder had never been forgotten, and science had finally caught up with her killer. They laid out the events of Valentine's night 1974, how Carla and her boyfriend, Rodney M. Coy, had gone to a Valentine's dance, stopped at a bowling alley, and lingered in his car when a stranger approached. They painted the image of M.C. Curley holding a gun to Rodney's head, pistol whipping him unconscious, and dragging Carla away. They told the jury how her body was found days later, bound and brutalized, discarded near Benbrook Lake. And then came the science. Expert witnesses walked the jury through the process of extracting DNA from the decades-old evidence. They explained how forensic genealogy had identified M.C. Curley's family tree, how discarded items from his trash had confirmed match, and how the probability of error was virtually non-existent. For Carla's family, each fact was a blow, painful but necessary. For the jury, the picture became clearer. This wasn't coincidence, and it wasn't guesswork. It was science pinning a man to a crime he had buried for 46 years. Rodney M.C. Coy speaks. Perhaps the most emotional moment of the trial came when Rodney M.C. Coy, Carla's high school sweetheart, took the stand. His voice carried the weight of a boy who had never truly left that car on Valentine's night. He described how he had regained consciousness, his head bleeding, his heart racing, and how he had realized Carla was gone. For decades, he had lived with survivor's guilt, replaying those moments over and over again, wondering if he could have stopped it. Looking across the courtroom at McCurley, Rodney's words were steady but raw. "He took everything from me that night. He took the person I loved most in this world." The courtroom was silent. The defense falters. McCurley's defense attempted to cast doubt, pointing to his age, his failing health, and the long passage of time. They suggested contamination of evidence or misinterpretation of DNA results. But the jury wasn't moved. The science was too strong, the evidence too compelling, and the story too consistent. The verdict. As the trial reached its conclusion, the jury didn't deliberate long. The DNA evidence, coupled with the haunting testimony of Rodney and the unshakable facts, pointed in only one direction. MC Curley was found guilty of capital murder in the death of Carla Walker. For Carla's family, the word guilty carried a bittersweet weight. It couldn't bring her back, and it couldn't erase decades of pain, but it finally gave her justice. After 46 years, the silence was broken. The sentence. Texas law allowed for the possibility of the death penalty, but given MC Curley's age and the passage of time, prosecutors sought life in prison without parole. As the sentence was read, MC Curley sat quietly, barely reacting. To the world, he was an old man in failing health. To Carla's family, he was forever the 31-year-old predator who had stolen their daughter and sister. Rodney McCoy, speaking after the trial, said, "Carla finally got her day in court. She finally got to tell her story." In the end, MC Curley was led out of the courtroom in shackles. He would die in prison, his name forever tied not to the quiet anonymity he had cultivated for decades, but to the murder of a 17-year-old girl who never made it home from her Valentine's date. The trial was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning, a message that no matter how much time passes, no matter how deeply a crime is buried, truth can rise. Carla Walker's story did not end in that courtroom in 2021. Justice, yes, had been delivered, but the shadow of her murder stretched far beyond her family. It reached into Fort Worth's collective memory, into the practices of law enforcement, and into the evolving field of forensic science that ultimately cracked the case. For nearly 5 decades, Carla's murder hung over Fort Worth like an unfinished sentence. Generations came and went, but the case never drifted far from local consciousness. People remembered the beautiful 17-year-old girl with a wide smile and soft eyes. They remembered the whispers in neighborhoods, the caution in parents' voices when reminding their daughters not to stay out too late, not to trust too easily. Carla became, in many ways, a symbol of vulnerability, the reminder that evil could touch even the most ordinary moments, like a Valentine's date in a parked car. By the time Glenn MC Curley was arrested, there were people in Fort Worth who had grown old themselves while waiting for closure. They had carried Carla's story the way one carries a wound, always present, sometimes scabbed over, but never fully healed. For the detectives who had cycled through the case over the years, Carla's file was more than paperwork. It was a personal weight. Retired officers would later admit they couldn't drive past the bowling alley or Benbrook Lake without remembering her. They remembered the interviews, the false leads, the feeling that justice was slipping through their fingers. When DNA technology first entered the crime-solving world in the late 1980s and early 1990s, there had been hope. But the samples in Carla's case were fragile, degraded, limited. The science wasn't ready yet. That waiting became part of the story, detectives holding on to evidence like a lifeline, knowing the day might come when technology would catch up. That day came in 2020, when investigators turned to forensic genealogy, the same cutting-edge technique that had identified the Golden State Killer just 2 years earlier. By comparing crime scene DNA to databases of consumer genealogy sites, analysts could build family trees, tracing lines until a suspect emerged. In Carla's case, this new science pointed directly at MC Curley. His name wasn't new. He had been interviewed in 1974, even offered up his gun at the time. But with no hard evidence, suspicion never turned into charges. Forensic genealogy changed that. It transformed a nearly 50-year-old cold case into a solvable puzzle, with DNA filling in the missing pieces. And Carla's case joined a growing list of cold cases closed through this method. Across the United States, families who had waited decades were suddenly seeing answers because science had learned how to listen to voices long silenced. Carla's justice rippled outward. For Fort Worth police, it was validation, proof that persistence matters, that keeping cold cases alive is not an exercise in futility. For families of other victims, it was a signal of hope. If Carla's case could be solved after 46 years, then maybe theirs could too. And for the nation, it was a demonstration of how forensic genealogy could reshape criminal justice. What once felt like science fiction, solving crimes through distant relatives' DNA, was now a powerful practical tool. But alongside the triumph sat the cost of decades lost. Carla's parents went to their graves without ever knowing her killer's name. They had lived through suspicion, rumors, and heartbreak without the comfort of justice. Her siblings, her boyfriend Rodney, her friends, all of them had aged under the weight of silence. For them, the trial was not just about holding MC Curley accountable. It was about lifting a shadow that had followed them since they were teenagers. Rodney, in particular, carried the longest shadow. His life had been marked by survivor's guilt, by the memory of Carla being dragged from his car while he was unconscious. The trial brought closure, yes, but also reopened wounds. "I've lived with this every day," he said, "and I'll live with it for the rest of my life." Carla's case now lives as part of a bigger story, a story about what happens when patience meets science, when families refuse to give up, when detectives keep a file open on their desk for decades. It's about the resilience of memory, about the refusal to let victims become statistics, about the long arc of justice bending, slowly, toward truth. Carla Walker is no longer just the girl in a yearbook photo, smiling in her cheerleading uniform. She is now a symbol of what can happen when we refuse to stop asking questions, when we refuse to let silence be the final word. Carla Walker was just 17 years old, a daughter, a sister, a friend, a girl who loved cheerleading, who laughed easily, who dreamed of a future that should have stretched far beyond a February night in 1974. Her life was stolen in an act of brutal violence. Her parents died without answers. Her boyfriend carried scars that time could never erase. And for nearly half a century, her name was a question hanging heavy in Fort Worth. But justice, though late, did not forget her. Science refused to let her story disappear. And because of persistence, because of DNA, because investigators never gave up, Carla's killer was finally unmasked. This is not just about one case. It's about every victim waiting in silence, every family staring at an empty chair, every cold case file gathering dust, hoping for the day technology or determination breathes new life into it. Carla's story is proof. Silence is not the end. Memory is not powerless, and justice, though delayed, can still arrive. So, as you hear her name, remember her not just for how she died, but for how she lived, for her light, her laughter, and the reminder that no case, no matter how old, should be abandoned. And now, I turn to you. If this story moved you, share it. If you believe Carla's memory matters, leave her name in the comments. Keep her voice alive. Subscribe to Vanished Voices, where we refuse to let these stories fade, where justice is remembered, and where silence is never the final word. Because Carla Walker deserves that, and so does every victim still waiting in the shadows.